when he comes to a P. Diddy party. This is what happens to the white man. When they come to one of my parties, this is what happens to them.
One of entertainment's biggest powerhouses comes crashing down.
I was up, but I made no excuses. I'm disgusted. I'm so sorry.
A year ago, Sean Combs stood in Times Square and was handed a key to New York City. Today, he's been indicted and will face justice.
Diddy just collapsed in court, his world shattered in a single moment, a moment that most thought would never come. The judge locked eyes with him and, with a voice that cut like a blade, dropped the hammer. Years of incarceration. A prison sentence. So severe, so undeniable, that even the most diehard defenders fell silent.
Monumental verdict in the Sean Diddy Combs criminal trial. The question now is, what is next for him, right? You got sentencing, civil suits, a lot to get into. So while Combs was acquitted of racketeering conspiracy and the sex trafficking charges that he was facing, he was convicted of transportation to engage in prostitution. Currently, sentencing is set for October 3rd. However, there is a hearing set for July 8th where the defense will be arguing for the sentencing date to be expedited, to happen sooner. Obviously, they want that, considering Combs was also denied bail yet again, despite arguments from his legal counsel after the verdict that he should be released on bond. It didn't happen. They want to make sure this happens as quickly as possible. But what will he be sentenced to, really? That's the question. And also, will the government seize his assets? What about all of those civil lawsuits that he faces? Again, a lot of questions, a lot to get into. So for all of this, let me bring on former sex crimes prosecutor and criminal defense attorney, the great Matt Murphy is with us. Matt, good to see you.
Happy to be here, as always.
Got to ask you your reaction to the verdict. Is it what you expected?
Well, hearkening back to, I don't know, we were talking about this, you and I, a couple of months ago, and I got to say, whether it's fun to be right or not in a case like this, we were both right. This was never a good fit for Rico for a lot of different reasons. And the consent element regarding the sex trafficking was always problematic. And I thought the prosecution here did a good job presenting their case. They did a good job presenting their theory. But when you match in a trial context, when you match like professorial and kind of plotting, which is the way a lot of government lawyers are, versus dynamic and engaging and that personality of the defense, it's always a mismatch. You're always up against it. And the Mann Act, like we talked about, I thought he was going down on that after like the second day of testimony. The problem is for the prosecution, the Mann Act is a very old law, and it was essentially legislative morality from about 100 years ago, where it was transporting prostitutes across state lines. The intent may have been good. It was essentially a very early version of sex trafficking, but it was really more an attempt to stop prostitution, which is, as we know, never going to happen. So almost every lonely guy in New York City who's going through a divorce, who is having a problem in a dating pool, who has some sex worker drive over from New Jersey, if he buys her Uber or his Uber, theoretically, that's a violation of the Mann Act. So that is it's not the same type of crime. There's no mandatory minimum under federal law. The judge does not have to. That. Right. They don't have to. Now, it carries up to 10 years per event. So he faces up to 20 years. The prosecution, I think, is asking for 46 months or something like that. They're asking for far less than that.
If the case was, if they had called, let's say, Christina Courtroom, okay, this chief of staff who had been mentioned, I think, by almost every witness, and she said, hey, listen, there was a criminal enterprise, okay? We were all a part of it. Everybody knew what the job description was. My job was to do this. His job was to do this. You think they would have gotten racketeering? If they didn't include Jane, who was arguably the more problematic testimony, I mean, Sean Combs still paying her rent, messages that she was setting up a lot of these sexual encounters.
The courtroom froze. The mighty had fallen. This wasn't speculation. This wasn't internet drama. This was the raw, uncut downfall of one of the most powerful figures in entertainment history. Inside that courtroom, you could feel the tension in the air. Every breath felt heavier than the last. Diddy sat there, surrounded by lawyers, but none of them could save him. Not this time. Not from this. The arrogance, the smirks, the designer suits, All gone, stripped away. What remained was a man who knew it was over. When the judge read the sentence, it wasn't just words. It was judgment. It was retribution. It was a reckoning. And did he? He collapsed. Physically, emotionally, spiritually. The weight of decades of deceit finally came crashing down on his back. The courtroom didn't erupt. It went still, like everyone knew they were watching history. The fall of a titan. The charges were brutal, federal level, and concrete, built on years of investigations, testimonies, leaked footage, and witness statements.
You know, Cassie had messages too that were problematic that showed, if we're talking about whether she was a willing participant or not, but if you focus just on Cassie and you didn't call in Jane, or you didn't call in a Mia, or you didn't call in a Brianna Bengolan, if you limited the case, and now it's so easy to play, you know, Monday morning quarterback or armchair lawyer here, but do you feel that the prosecution could have won this case if they structured it differently, if they called different witnesses?
That's a great question, and that's something that these prosecutors will literally be wondering for the rest of their lives, for the rest of their careers. They're going to be wondering if they'd done it differently, would the impact upon the jury and would the result have been different. The fundamental problem, I think, is that this was kind of always a round peg in a square hole. The arson, that domestic violence video that we all watched, that's horrific. All of that should have been prosecuted as state crimes in Los Angeles. That as a fundamental, starting point.
Well, they couldn't
So
do it now. It
basically,
was
they
time
take
barred.
no, of course, the statute is run on everything, but
Yep.
that would have been, he would have been prosecuted for exactly what he did instead of predicate acts into a RICO theory. Now, RICO, as we know, was designed for essentially mafia organization, for organized crime. And the idea is simply because there's a legitimate business, like in The Godfather, they had a legitimate olive oil importing business, and that was but it was still a criminal enterprise. The real thing was the mafia. The real thing was the organized crime surrounding the Corleone family, to use an example that everybody can probably relate to. So simply because their olive oil importing business was legitimate, that's not a defense to a RICO thing. That's the current state of the law. What they did here is they took a business that was always legitimate, Bad Boy Records, that was always and the purpose is to make music and make money. Everything surrounded that. And the defense argument, which they obviously argued very effectively, was that is not a criminal enterprise. So the very first element of RICO has always been problematic
Yeah.
from the very beginning. You and I talked about that 2 months ago when this whole
Yep.
thing started. And and the jury, this was a sober jury that
Yeah.
the questions were serious and direct. And, they sent that note out regarding juror 25 right at the very beginning saying, hey, this guy's not deliberating. And so this was a serious group, and the Mann Act, they did convict on that. So they were,
Sure.
by the fact that it was unanimous, meant that they were getting along. Federal juries tend to be, in California anyway, we have, they draw our state juries off the DMV database. That's how you get jury duty, is from the DMV. Federally, it's based on voter rolls. So it's people who are conscientious enough to actually vote, and you tend to get a more serious class of juror
Right.
in federal court, which I think is interesting. So to answer your question, it's something that we could kick around for
Sure.
years.
Sure.
But I think the fundamental problem here is that it was always kind of a misfit for a RICO theory. Just
I
like
get
the
it.
sex trafficking requires fraud, force, or coercion, right? So that essentially is the same elements of rape. So you essentially, it's transporting somebody under circumstances that equate to rape.
Yep.
Is something forceful, something fearful. That it just doesn't fit very well here,
I
especially
get
when
it.
you're talking about all these
Yeah.
people they're orbiting him. They're all trying to advance their own career. And when the defense attorney got up and said, Cassie got $30 million as a result of her settlement, right? And that was
Yeah.
a big move.
Yeah, I wasn't sold for that personally, because I was like, the prosecution came back and be like, she already settled. What's her incentive to come here and lie? What's her incentive to be a part of this? And that for me, but I think the messages.
The courtroom froze. The mighty had fallen. This wasn't speculation. This wasn't internet drama. This was the raw, uncut downfall of one of the most powerful figures in entertainment history. Inside that courtroom, you could feel the tension in the air. Every breath felt heavier than the last. Diddy sat there, surrounded by lawyers, but none of them could save him. Not this time. Not from this. The arrogance, the smirks, the designer suits, all gone, stripped away. What remained was a man who knew it was over. When the judge read the sentence, it wasn't just words. It was judgment. It was retribution. It was a reckoning. And Diddy? He collapsed, physically, emotionally, spiritually. The weight of decades of deceit finally came crashing down on his back. The courtroom didn't erupt. It went still, like everyone knew they were watching history. The fall of a titan. The charges were brutal, federal level, and concrete, built on years of investigations, testimonies, leaked footage, and witness statements.